I'm Michael Ettlinger. I'm the director of the Carsey School of Public Policy. We're a fairly new school. We're about a year old now, and we're in the transition from being the Carsey Institute to the Carsey School, which brings with it a lot of exciting and interesting changes. One I'll just mention, which is within the next few weeks, or in a few weeks, we very much hope to have a new Master's in Public Policy degree approved through the university and be able to announce it. I'm not actually allowed to talk about it. So, but for any of you interested in getting a Master's in Public Policy or know people who are, check out our website in a few weeks, and it's really going to be, I'm very proud of what we're coming up with, and it's really going to be a great program. So that's my one quick plug for Carsey work here. So a few thank yous are in order. First to the Rudman Center, which is a co-host of this event. So thank you to Rudman for all their help. I have the honor of being a faculty fellow with Rudman, as well as my day job. Also, of course, the law school, the Rudman Center is situated here at the law school, and you see Dean Jordan Budd up here from the law school. So thank you for everybody at the law school for making all of this possible. And of course, Results for America, the organization which pulled together this panel. I've been very interested in results-oriented, evidence-based policymaking for a long time when I was in Washington, and Results for America is really carrying the ball on that, really working hard on a bipartisan basis across the country to orient policy more to things that are based on, that is data-driven and based on evidence. I commend to you their book, Moneyball for Government. It's got a very distinguished bipartisan authorship, including New Hampshire's own Senator Kelly Ayotte. So we have a great panel today. I'm not going to introduce them all, but they're people who I've either known or admired in DC for a long time, and so it's going to be a great panel. Unfortunately, Michelle Jolin, who's the CEO of Results for America, couldn't be here. She had a family situation she had to deal with, but fortunately, we have David Medina, who will be taking her place as moderator. And David has a long record of accomplishment in a variety of posts. He's the COO of Results for America. Most recently, he was in the Obama administration as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Michelle Obama and as the Director of Public Engagement for the Peace Corps. I got that right, yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to David to introduce the rest of the panel. I think it's going to be a great event. But before that, we have a greeting on video from Senator Ayotte.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to share a few words with you during today's panel discussion. I want to thank today's speakers for being here to talk about ways we can make government work better and work smarter and save taxpayer dollars in the process. With our nation's $18 trillion in debt, we need to look for ways to find savings across government. And to make sure that we get the most out of every taxpayer dollar, we need to invest in programs that actually work and deliver results. That's where Moneyball comes in. Billy Beane famously pioneered the use of performance data to improve the Oakland A's, and they saw a record-setting winning streak as a result. We need to do the same with government, focusing limited taxpayer dollars on the most effective and efficient solutions to address the policy decisions facing our nation. I was pleased to partner with my friend and colleague, Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat from Virginia, on a chapter for the Moneyball book. Washington wastes millions of dollars on wasteful, duplicative, and ineffective programs. That's an obvious place to start in finding savings. Taxpayers deserve to know what programs work and which ones don't, and government should make decisions about these programs accordingly. As leaders of the Senate Budget Committee's Government Performance Task Force, Senator Warner and I have worked together to identify and eliminate unnecessary and duplicative federal programs. One bill we introduced, the Digital Accountability and Transparency, or DATA Act, was signed into law in May of last year. The The Data Act standardizes federal financial and spending data, making it accessible so taxpayers can see how their hard-earned dollars are being spent. Senator Warner and I have also worked to eliminate unnecessary federal reports. I'm working on another bill called the Duplication Elimination Act. Since 2011, the federal government has lagged in implementing recommendations by the Government Accountability Offices to eliminate wasteful, duplicative, or overlapping government programs. The bill I helped introduce would require the President to submit a plan to Congress to implement GAO's recommendations, and Congress would have to act quickly on enacting legislation. It would also put any GAO-spurred savings towards deficit reduction. Those are just a few ideas to make government more effective and efficient. Just like statistics help sports managers choose the right players, performance data can help policymakers choose the right investments and end underperforming programs. Forums like this one that bring together New Hampshire residents on all sides of the political spectrum foster healthy discussions about improving government and making it work better for all of us. I'm encouraged that so many of you are taking part in this important conversation, and I look forward to partnering with you as we work to make Moneyball for Government a reality.
My name is David Medina, and I'm with Results for America. And on behalf of our entire team, I want to thank the Carsey School and the Rudman Center, and Michael in particular, for allowing us to co-host today's event. As Michael mentioned, Results for America is a relatively new nonprofit organization based in DC, and we have one basic mission, and that is to try to work with elected leaders to invest taxpayer dollars in evidence-based solutions. And so we have a three-part strategy that we follow in order to try to do that. First, we've been focused on building a bipartisan coalition of like-minded leaders across the political spectrum who believe in this mission. Secondly, we've been working to develop new policies and programs that would shift taxpayer dollars towards results-driven, evidence-based policies. And third, we're here to support elected officials who are making the tough decisions to making sure that we're investing in what works. And in 2003, in order to make our campaign as compelling as possible to the general public and to elected officials, we launched a new national campaign called Moneyball for Government, which is based on the best-selling book by Michael Lewis, which is all about the Oakland A's and Billy Beane and how they used their limited resources to focus on players who merited being a part of the team because of their stats. It's also based on the Brad Pitt movie that some of you may recall. And our campaign is founded on three very simple principles. One, that we should build evidence of what works. Secondly, that we should invest taxpayer dollars in those efforts that have been proven to work. And third, we should shift taxpayer dollars away from efforts that consistently fail to achieve desired outcomes. So over the last 3 years, we've been able to work with nearly 100 local, state, and federal leaders who've agreed to publicly support these principles and be publicly identified as a part of our campaign as Moneyball for Government All-Stars. And New Hampshire is the one and only state that has both of its U.S. senators who've agreed to be a part of this campaign. Senator Ayotte became a Moneyball for Government All-Star last November, and Senator Shaheen agreed to be a part of this All-Star team today as a part of today's event. So as Senator Ayotte mentioned, last November we published a book called Moneyball for Government. You can see the sign behind me. And we included several chapters which I would just point you all to. One is the one by Senator Ayotte and Senator Warner, which had a lot of thought-provoking reasons why Democrats and Republicans should support this agenda. This book also includes bipartisan chapters that were written by Clinton, Bush, and Obama senior White House staffers, including Ron Haskins, who's here on our panel. This book also highlights innovative and entrepreneurial leaders from all across the country who support and are implementing this agenda in all sectors. And our book featured Jim Shelton, who's on our panel here. And so this afternoon, Jim and Ron will use their experience at the federal level to tell you how government can and should play Moneyball. And John Pohenko is going to be here to use his nearly 40 years of experience at the municipal level to also share his thoughts on how local government can play Moneyball at the local level too. So before I introduce our panelists, just three basic housekeeping items. First, I will be leading a discussion among our three panelists till about 3:45. And then at that point, we'll take questions from the audience here. We are also broadcasting this panel discussion live online. So for those of you watching us online, you can also submit questions by using our hashtag #MoneyBallUNH. And we have someone here who will help us take those questions too. Secondly, hopefully you all received one of these postcards as you were walking in. We've worked it out with Amazon so that all of you can download our Moneyball for Government book for free, but you have to do so before tonight. So don't forget to get your free download of our book today. On the other side of this postcard, it also describes our Results for America's 2016 Policy Playbook. These are 20 ideas, many of which are also featured in our book, that we've developed in coordination with, again, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and other former White House leaders for the next president of the United States. And you can get a download of that report from our RFA website, which is resultsforamerica.org, and the 4 is the number instead of the word. Third, and finally, I won't go through our panelists' complete bios, but you can all find those online where you registered for today's event. I'll just give some brief highlights of their backgrounds today. So without any further ado, let me now introduce our first distinguished speaker, Ron Haskins. Ron is a senior fellow and the Cabot Family Chair in Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution in DC, where he co-directs the Center on Children and Families and the Budgeting for National Priorities project. Ron also previously served as a senior advisor to the President for Welfare Policy in the G.W. Bush White House. And Ron is also the author of several books, including his most recent, Show Me the Evidence, Obama's Fight for Rigor and Evidence in Social Policy, which I strongly recommend to all of you, and hopefully he'll tell us how you can all get a copy of that too. So Ron, let me just start with a few questions for you, just to kick us off here. So I think the goal here today is to start us off on a positive note. And so Ron, can you give us a description of some of the federal programs you highlight in your book that actually prove that federal governments can be made more evidence-based and more results-driven?
The Bush administration, for reasons that are hard to fathom, I think there's a lot of coincidence involved, but they assembled a team of people who were greatly committed to evidence, mostly economists, a few lawyers, but they all wound up in the White House, especially at the Office of Management and Budget, or in the actual White House. They're right there together for those of you who know Washington. And headed by Peter Orszag, who was the head of OMB. OMB, other than the president, is probably one of the most powerful people in Washington. And Orszag was determined to base policy, federal policy, on evidence. Well, we already have a lot of federal policy. We spend $1 trillion a year on social programs, and a lot of those programs do not work. We now have lots of evaluations showing that. So the administration wanted to do two things. It wanted to identify programs that work based on scientific research design, random assignment, for those of you who are familiar with the language. We can talk about that if you'd like to. And then to get rid of programs that don't, we should make an all-star of any member of Congress who gets rid of even one dinky little $50 program. That's a huge achievement. Washington loves to create programs, but it's they're like monsters. They keep coming back. The kudzu social programs in the federal government. When Republicans first came in, I recall in '96, cut agriculture programs, something fierce. First time it had ever been done. Within 5 years, they were all back. So it's very difficult to cut programs. But the Obama administration created 6, and that's the way I counted in the book, but I think we could add Head Start because they've had the
Redesigned it, yeah.
most important reforms of Head Start in the history of the program. I chaired a committee along with Margaret Spellings, who was Secretary of Education in the Bush administration, and we could not get to first base thinking of Head Start reforms, very much like what the administration managed to do, and especially because the administration was wise enough not to try to pass it in Congress. Head Start enjoys a tremendous reputation in the Congress, about 75% not deserved. So the Republicans consistently told us in the House and the Senate, we don't want to take this on. So don't put us in a position where we have to vote to make any big changes in Head Start. So Obama did it by administrative order, and now we really have very serious changes in Head Start. Some of the programs are losing their funding, unheard of in a Democratic administration. They actually take money away from a social program and subject the programs to competition from other programs. And so if they're not performing, they could lose their money. That's a very important point. The 6 Obama evidence-based initiatives in teen pregnancy, in home visiting, in something called the Social Innovation Fund, and then 2 in labor force programs, all were based on 2 premises, and this is the heart of the answer, and I'm going to stop with this. And this is the most important thing that I'm going to say today. First, the Obama administration wanted to be sure that the maximum number of federal dollars were spent on programs that had strong scientific evidence of success. And so these 6 new programs were set up that the people who got the money had to be using programs that had, at least 75% of the money had to be spent on programs with strong evidence of success. If we did just that, our progress against the nation's leading social programs would improve dramatically. I have no doubt of that. Why? Because we have lots of programs and have more every year. Jim knows a lot about this, of programs that actually work in education, teen pregnancy prevention, home visiting, a whole series of programs. But we don't necessarily spend money on those programs. We spend money on junky programs that have no evidence of success. Consider Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. $15 billion a year. We've been doing it since 1967. Do the math. And we not only don't have evidence of success, we spend a lot of that money in ways that we're not even sure how the state spend it. So we could really improve if we would do that, just that one thing. Spend our money on programs that have evidence of success. And then the second thing is, and this is also a crucial thing, evaluate our programs to find out if they're actually working. Even programs that have evidence of success, when you try something that was developed in New York, in Spearfish, South Dakota, it might not work. So you need evaluation to figure out if it's working. And if it doesn't, change it and give it a year or 2 more years to change and improve. And if it doesn't, then cut the funding. So those 2 steps are crucial. And these Obama initiatives, I think, are the first programs that really focused everybody's attention on these 2 principles of evidence-based policy, or as you prefer, Moneyball.
Great. Yeah, one political question. Given that we're in the first in the nation primary state, why is it good politics for Democrats and Republicans to play Moneyball? Because
Americans like things that work. And if you can produce evidence that programs work, Americans like that. As I said, we're spending $1 trillion of taxpayer money on social programs, most of which don't work. I don't think America knows that very well. They may have a suspicion about that, and there are big differences between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are much more skeptical about whether the programs work, but they mostly don't work. So if we can create programs that actually do work, take teen pregnancy prevention, for example. Do you realize that since 1991, we have reduced teen pregnancy every year except 2, and we've reduced teen pregnancy by 60% over that period. And the federal programs play a major role in this. So we can make progress against our social problems, and if we do that and communicate to the American public that we're doing that, they will approve, and they will approve of politicians who support those programs and vote for them.
Great. Let me now turn to our second distinguished panelist, one of the top policy and political folks in the country, and one of Results for America's very own senior fellows, Jim Shelton. Jim most recently served as the Deputy Secretary and Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Department of Education. He also served as the Executive Director of the President's My Brothers Initiative. But Jim has also held senior roles in the public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic sectors, including at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and also at the New Schools Venture Fund. So Jim, as someone who helped shape education policy in the Obama administration for several years, can you just give us a flavor of, what were some of the barriers that you came across? What were some of the successes that you were able to achieve during your time there?
Wow. So one, thanks for letting me be here with you today. I want to come back to a point that Ron was making before I jump into that. I think that one of the real opportunities we have in this particular environment, with the hostility as great as it is on all sides and people really not being willing to hear each other, is that the thing we all have in common is we need Americans on either side of the spectrum to begin to believe in government again, to believe in the country, to believe the government can work, to believe we can fix the problems that we have. And so the point that Ron made about needing to show that things work is critical whether you are Republican or Democrat, because frankly they're tired of all of us, because they don't think we actually solve problems. So this is no longer just a wonky policy issue. This is a fight for whether people believe our democracy can work the way it was meant to solve the people's problems. So whether you are a progressive and you actually just want better outcomes for the people who you think are most in need and to be able to serve more of them and save money by doing so, this is a great approach. If you are a fiscal hawk and you want to make sure the dollars are spent really well and stop spending as much money anymore, don't spend another dime more than we have to, this is great policy for you. It doesn't really matter which way you come at it. This is just a smart way to do the work. I was really excited about the number of the things that I was able to do while I was in the administration. When I came in, I was not the deputy secretary. I ran what was called the innovation portfolio, which also meant I had the office that had about 75% of the department's competitive grants. A couple of things to note when I showed up. One is that 85% of the programs had never been evaluated. Now, think about that. You got an office that spends literally over $1 billion a year in grants, demonstration grants, right? That's what competitive grants are for the most part. And nobody spent the money to figure out whether the demonstrations produced the outcomes they were looking for. And this is cutting across administration, Democrat, Republican, nobody wanted to look. So it doesn't matter what party you're in, that just doesn't make any sense. So the second thing is the constructs that we need to put in place for asking and answering some of these questions just weren't there. Whenever you're on a panel like this, there's all kinds of superlatives that get thrown out, which are mostly not deserved, I will say, especially in my case. But I did help create this one program that people really credited with being innovative. It's called the Invest in Innovation Fund. It actually had a really long name in the beginning. It was called the Invest in What Works and Innovation Fund. And the story of that is that they got it done by people having totally different expectations of what it was supposed to do. I mean, literally on my first week of the job, I got a call from one staffer on the Hill who said, "We're so glad you're there. We know you're going to bring real rigor to this, real evidence about what works, all the gold standard studies to this work." And I got another call from another staffer from another office who said, "We know, we're so glad you're there. We know you're going to do really out-of-the-box, innovative things, et cetera, with this funding, $650 million out of the Recovery Act." And so what we did was something that people thought was really, really outstanding. And here's the secret. Are you ready? Give a little bit of money to the people with a little bit of evidence, and give a lot of money to the people with a lot of evidence, and make them all evaluate all of them. That's it. Now, you're sitting there going, yeah? And that's the point. The point is, yeah, we should be doing this all the time. Like, why shouldn't our entire structure of grants and funding and programs be built off a system that says we have evidence of some things that work, and in fact most of our dollars should be going to those things. Even these formula funds that we have ought to put priority on funding those things that actually have some evidence that work. Now, none of those things work well enough that we should be sitting on our laurels. We should also be stimulating innovation. But at every step along the way, we should be gating them by testing to see whether or not they're working. And if they're not working, then are they bad enough to be cut off? Or if with tweaking, should we push them forward and try them some other way? But it is common sense that we should be spending most of our money on the things that work and feeding the pipeline by vetting things at large numbers in ways that let us begin to figure out how we begin to fill that evidence-based priority list. We were able to do that not only in that program, but to begin to build an infrastructure for doing this work across the agency. So, interesting thing, this is something that was not directly in my purview, but there was, at the Institute of Educational Sciences, no framework for studying cost effectiveness of education programs. Now think about that. You got the institute that is supposed to help promote what works in education. It does do rigorous evaluations of programs, but does not have a methodology that it promotes for how you figure out whether or not it was cost effective or not. So you can get a great answer that something works and it still be completely impractical relative to taking it to scale. So there are many more things I'll talk about throughout the conversation, but those kinds of things are the things that I think are pretty common sense that everyone can do, that we're able to get some of, but not enough done because politics got in the way.
Jim, there seems to be a growing momentum for this drive towards evidence within government, but also within nonprofits and foundations. Given your background, can you sort of tell us, like, how is what's happening in government affecting the nonprofit philanthropic sectors and vice versa?
Yeah. So, I mean, it has actually been really great that is working symbiotically. The reality that one of the things that happened, again, I'll talk about the program we created, was that we said we wanted to have the philanthropic sector invest some capital in matching grants to the folks that we gave these evidence-based grants to. And there were two reasons for that. The first one for me was to begin to actually push this framework of, tiered evidence, a little bit of money for a little bit of evidence, a lot of money for a lot of evidence, out into the field as the way that you think about making grants. The second is that it was the first time we'd done it. And so our structures inside government are very rigid. You might know, some of you may have even participated on peer review panels and things like that. The construct is very rigid, and sometimes it makes it, in the pursuit of fairness, difficult for judgment to play a good role. Think about it this way, I don't know many, I used to be in the private sector, I don't know any venture capitalists who invest money without ever meeting the management team, especially not millions and millions of dollars. But that's principally the way we give or invest through the government. So I wanted to have philanthropic folks on the other side taking a look at these investments and making decisions about whether they were going to invest as well, because they have more flexibility about how they evaluate. What wound up happening is two things. One is that you learn very quickly from the philanthropic sector that they've been struggling with this issue of how much evidence and where should they play in the spectrum, because are their dollars supposed to be catalytic for scale, or are they supposed to be driving innovation? And the answer to some of that is both, depending on who you are and in what context you're working. But the second thing is that none of us had a way to talk to each other about what standards we were using, what rigor really meant, or any of those things, and we began to coalesce around those things as well. And so what you're starting to see now is agreement on what the spectrum of evidence looks like, agreement about what kinds of infrastructure we actually need to begin to evaluate these things, and co-investment by both philanthropic resources and, frankly, then the nonprofit sector responding, saying we have to get our evidence shop in order to be able to compete for these funds, either from foundations or from government. And all of those things, I think, are great signals to where we can head in the future if people keep leaning both the public and the private funding streams in this direction.
Great, thanks. Let me now introduce our third distinguished panelist, New Hampshire's very own John Bohenko, who's a committed, long-serving elected official here in New Hampshire with over 36 years of experience at the municipal level. He has spent 18 years as city manager of Portsmouth, and has also had senior roles in other cities, serving as the Chief Executive Officer and Chief Administrative Officer for Plainville, Connecticut, and North Andover, Massachusetts. John, in conversations like this, we usually rely on people like you to tell us what's really happening on the ground. So can you give us any examples of your experience either in Portsmouth or the other cities where you worked, of how you've used data and evidence to improve lives, to make government more effective, more efficient?
Sure. Well, as many of you know, here in New Hampshire, about 78% of our revenues that we need to operate our cities and towns come from the property tax. So as you might think that there is a high scrutiny on us and how we spend every dollar. One of the things that we were doing about 10 years ago was updating our master plan, and I had a group of residents come in and talk to me about how I could start a green initiative, how we could do some sustainable practices, and how that could be part of the master plan. As part of that, I had a staff person that came to me and said, well, I have this opportunity to get a grant, and we can go forward and do this greenhouse inventory for the city of Portsmouth, and we can bring not only our residents into this through surveys, but also our employees, and talk about how they are saving at home, how we should be saving and have energy efficiencies in our organization. I was a little skeptical at the time, but I said, well, okay, we'll go forward with this. And so in 2006, we undertook that study. But I said to the staff person, I said, what I want to do is I want to bring all the department heads in on a regular basis and try to create a culture within the organization to look at every project we undertake, either a library, purchasing equipment, vehicles and the like, and say, how can we make ourselves more sustainable? And so we had this ongoing program, and so in 2012, the city was able to update its greenhouse emissions inventory. And we found that total energy consumption between those 6 years had decreased by 15%. We achieved the results through construction of LEED buildings, improved energy management in school facilities, reduced building square footage, and purchased more fuel-efficient vehicles. The city reduced its energy consumption in almost every sector of what we do. City buildings reduced energy consumption by 8%. A new LEED Silver library reduced its overall per square foot energy consumption by 65%. Likewise, we did a LEED fire station, and it reduced its per square foot energy consumption by 26%. The school department achieved dramatic reductions in energy consumption in almost all of its facilities. They reduced their per square foot energy consumption, the most at Sherburne Elementary School by 71%, and at the high school by 40%. The city reduced emissions from its vehicles by 2%, and we also added vehicles to our inventory, so that included that reduction as well. The decrease in the results of our newly purchased cars and trucks have had a great improvement on fuel economy, as well as different types of vehicles that we have purchased. So in every instance, every time throughout the organization, people are continually looking at how they can improve. So when this information came in and we found this data, I was very pleased 6 years later as the culture took hold within the organization. And we are continuing that culture within the organization and on all our projects. We just finished a project in a street project. State Street, I don't know, many of you know where State Street is in Portsmouth, but we had just undertaken that project. And we won an award for the sustainable practices that we have within that street. So we found that the City Council has supported us in many of our programs that we want to do for energy efficiencies. A lot of times there's really a view of the short term because, again, all of you know that property tax is the way we run our local communities, and either you have a town meeting that might be putting pressure on reducing the tax rate, or City Council may be putting pressure on reducing the tax rate. But when we show paybacks for these energy efficiencies, we find that we get great support. And right now we're in the process of working with a couple towns to look at doing LED lighting for all our street lights. And we're showing there is going to be a large upfront cost to doing this, but we're showing that it's about a 3.8-year payback. And there's a lot of not only energy savings, but we can improve services with some of the smart technology that will be going on all those
And
poles.
what political barriers or cost barriers came up that you had to work through?
Well, I think just an example came when we wanted to do the LEED certified library. There were more upfront costs that we had to put into the building. Rather than it being a $9 million building, it was, there would be $11 million that might be spent. And the extra money was going into some of these efficiencies that we were having throughout the building that came back over in a short period of time in payback. But when we had the public hearings and the like, there was always that push to keep it lower, 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 even though we were trying to explain that over the long term, we're going to save money within our operating budgets. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is to try to educate people. And I think this study alone was able to show that over 6 years, the amount of work that was done was able to reduce our energy consumption and gas emissions.
That's great. And you know, so we've talked about Moneyball and education and in energy efficiency, but Ron, you had a very senior role developing welfare policy in the White House. Can you give us an example of how you use data, evidence, and evaluation to affect and inform those sets of
Yeah,
laws?
and in fact, not many people realize this, I don't think, but this is all the way back in 1995 and 96 when we had a huge welfare debate and wound up passing welfare legislation. The debate was initiated by President Clinton, who ran on ending welfare as we know it. Some of you may remember that phrase. And he wound up signing a bill that was quite a bit more radical than he intended at first, because Republicans in the meantime took over the House and the Senate and created a bill that was much more demanded work and had difficult sanctions in it that resulted in a lot of people leaving the welfare rolls. And the reason, I think, one of the things that drove that legislation was actual research. This was the first time, I think, that we had a large set of studies based on random assignment done all across the country, in Florida, in Arkansas, in California, in New York, where we found that if you help people, mothers on welfare, find jobs and then increase their earnings through public benefits like the Earned Income Tax Credit. We made some changes in the food stamp program, make it easier for families to continue getting food stamps, because most of mothers were only going to make $8 an hour, and they, in some cases, would be better off on welfare, except for these benefits. And Congress worked on the benefits. It wasn't just the work requirements, it was the benefits. So there was something for both sides in the debate. And as a result of welfare reform, and this research is showing that we could help mothers find jobs, that they would take jobs, and that they could hold down jobs, not all of them, of course, but many of them, and enough could do it so that we would actually increase the income of female-headed families. And if we're going to make progress against poverty in the United States, we have to focus on female-headed families, because kids, get this, kids in female-headed families are 5 times as likely to be poor as kids in 2-parent families. And we have an increasing percentage of kids in female-headed families. About half of our children spend some time in a female-headed family. So if you can focus on female-headed families, which is what welfare reform did, and you can subsidize their earnings, you could reduce the poverty rate, and that's what happened. So we had a huge increase in employment by especially never married mothers, because they were the most disadvantaged group. And then we had a decline in child poverty. We had the lowest poverty rates ever for kids in female-headed families and for black children who are disproportionately in female-headed families. And even now, after 2 recessions, one of which is the most severe recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s, we still have a higher work rate among those mothers, and we still have a lower poverty rate among kids in female-headed families and among black children than we did before welfare reform. And a crucial part of that was the belief in Congress, because of testimony and papers and briefings and so forth, and this is something that American people don't know much about, but we have organizations in Washington like the Congressional Research Service and the Congressional Budget Office that Congress actually trusts. And they told the Congress in testimony and in documents that welfare could work, that mothers would take jobs, they needed help finding the jobs, they needed some support once they got in them. So all those factors combined to play a role in, on the one hand, getting mothers to work more, and on the other, changing our public programs so that moms who worked could retain benefits, and above all, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and we got the results that we were looking for. So that was a case, even 20 years ago, where research played a very important role, and we could do that more if we paid more attention to the research.
Great. Let me go ahead and open the floor up to any questions. As you can see, we have policy experts here in multiple issue areas and across sectors, so really we'll take any question you all have. Yes, and please stand up and introduce yourself, please.
Kim Lawler, University of New Hampshire. I'm just curious, the way you've characterized things is that Moneyball is this new thing and using evidence is a brand new concept. Could you just characterize previously, what was it like without using evidence? Surely there's always been a push to get some evidence before a policy is put in place, so that concept is not new. Could you just comment on the use
Right.
of it prior to this new era?
Yeah, this is a very good point.
Yeah.
It's not new, but Washington has ignored it. And the reason is I once made a chart when I first went to Brookings and I met with the trustees and they asked me to talk about what I learned about what influences policy decisions, especially on social policy in Congress. And the answer is party philosophy, the position of the chairman, constituent needs and so forth. And I had a little teeny sliver of the pie that was evidence. And that's the way it usually is. But that is changing. So it's not so much that the concept of using evidence is changing, is that policymakers in the Congress and in the administration are more likely than ever to do it. I was in the Bush administration. That means it's probably pretty good evidence that I'm a Republican. And I can tell you the Obama administration is by far the most evidence-based administration ever. I could go on for half an hour telling you new things that they have initiated besides the ones I've already talked about. And so it's way more that the Congress and the administration are focused on using evidence and actually paying attention to it and actually employing evidence to make decisions about how to spend the money. That's the key. If we keep moving in that direction, our social impact will improve.
I couldn't agree more, and it's not just because he said nice things about what happened in the Obama administration. Actually, I don't think I've ever told you. I think the only thing you've done that I would say I would wish you hadn't done is actually put the president's name in your book.
I've had a lot of Republicans tell me that. You have to use his name, you know.
Because I believe it is actually such clear. You are absolutely right. People have been collecting evidence and trying to do research for a long time. As Ron said, the only difference is creating real mechanisms where it actually drives decision-making and funding. Like, that is the difference. And building structures so that that actually is the way government works. Building the infrastructure so that collecting the evidence and information and data as we go along is easier and easier, so the transaction cost of doing this kind of work goes down and down and down and down. I mean, nowadays, every single business, large-scale enterprise in the world builds their business so they can collect the data to run experiments to figure out, if I show you this ad versus that ad, what are you going to buy more of? Like, that is just the way business is done now. A/B testing, rigorous evidence, that's what they're trying to produce. We don't have that kind of infrastructure for our social programs. It's not quite that simple a question, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't do it. We just haven't had the will. And I still, to this day, believe we were going to get some people with the evidence. And there are going to be some people who will wave around the evidence while they tell the story they want to tell anyway. But we'll be a lot better off than we are today, where the vast majority of decisions are made without even consulting the evidence. And that's progress.
In this book, Moneyball, Peter Orszag and John Bridgeland, who was a senior Republican, they both make a similar claim, which is, Orszag's version is, about 1% of total federal spending, we have any evidence of whether it works. Not that it works, but that we have any evidence at all. Because in the past, even though people talked about evidence and realized it was a good idea to use evidence to make policy, it just was not done. So as a result of that, I use the example of Title I. We just don't know the effects of our programs. That's changing.
Mm-hmm. And you know, one of the main goals of our group, Results for America, is to create the political will on both sides and make evidence sexy and make it relevant to the ongoing policy debate. And I think, Ron and Jim referenced Head Start, and I think that's the perfect model where you had Senators Enzi and Kennedy shepherd through a Head Start reauthorization bill through Congress, and then President Bush signed it into law. It moved more towards performance-based standards and evidence. Then it took the Obama administration to come out with very strong regulations. So, you know, both sides had something to lose in amending a very, very popular program. But, you know, the stars were aligned, and that program is much stronger now, and it's continuing to get stronger because there was will on both sides. Yes, please.
Kathy Crompton, and I'm from the Community Action Program in Stratford County. I agree, having been in this work several years, that evidence-based is, of course, the gold standard that we all want to look to. But I also want to say I agree with Jim that we do not have the infrastructure, we do not have the data, we don't have the people who can gather that for us. So often, I have seen, as I have lived my life, that less people are served as more people count the widgets of are we doing what we said we would do. And somehow I would like to see a process where people with their feet on the ground who are doing the work have an opportunity to talk with Ron here and explain that though those issues sound wonderful, I know that that welfare system does not work like that in New Hampshire. So I think that there's a real disconnect between what we try to do and what you're trying to do. Thank you.
Let me throw that to John, because what you're pointing out is, that at some point the rubber hits the road, where you can support evidence-based policymaking at the theoretical level, but when you're
Before
Sure.
I wanted to say for John, who I appreciate, and with Portsmouth, he has resources that poverty programs in New Hampshire do not have. So to compare what John is able to do with tax base, though it's not what he would want, certainly, is not really an accurate comparison. More accurate would be to compare us to somebody in Connecticut or Massachusetts.
Oh, yeah.
obviously.
No, I was shifting the conversation to John, because there's always this tension of, if we want to invest in what works, we need to know what works. And knowing what works means you have to evaluate policies and programs. Well, those evaluations cost money. So there's always this tension at the very beginning where, are you going to fund an evaluation, or are you going to serve more kids? Are you going to serve more homeless people? So that's the question I'd like to bring back to our panelists here is, how have you faced that question where some grantees are coming to you, or one city versus another saying, we support this in concept, but where are the resources to be able to make those right decisions so we can create the infrastructure?
Well, again, I think in New Hampshire, what she said is very evident in a lot of areas. They're there's not a lot of depth in a lot of the local governments in New Hampshire. People run programs and they do it and are not able to get the type of data that we were able to get in Portsmouth. But I would say that I wouldn't give up on it. It's something that we've tried to do working with other communities. In fact, working together with Dover and Rochester, we've been working on an issue that we've been dealing with the EPA on, and it affects water quality. And so because we have the resources, we've been able to develop some metrics that show and show the EPA that we have certain conditions that they thought were different in our water supply. So that goes towards trying to reduce costs that we're going to have to provide for our wastewater treatment plants, because throughout the region we're going to have wastewater treatment plants retrofitted and built new in Newmarket, Durham, Exeter, Rochester, Dover, and in Portsmouth. The issue really is nitrogen in the Great Bay, and so those types of things that we're trying to show on a scientific basis are not as evident in our area as it is in another area. And so even though maybe that didn't happen a number of years ago, because in the 1980s when I built a plant in Connecticut, we received 90% federal funding for our wastewater treatment plant. We didn't look outside and try to, are we going to reduce costs for this particular plant? Well, why? We get 90% funding, so we'll build the best and the tertiary plant and put all the bells and whistles on it, and we don't have to worry about it. Well, now every single dollar is coming out of a local government pocket. There is no state or federal grants to help us replace those wastewater treatment plants. So we have to look to see where we can make better decisions. And we're doing that through data that we have combined together with other communities. Now, the social programs in the state, I believe that everybody that works in the state on a local level, including the person that works in my welfare office, They do yeoman's work. They do get a lot of statistics. They do work together, and they do it on a almost on a volunteer basis, where the groups get together. There's, the welfare groups get together. They find out what is working for them. They get the data together the best they can, and they go up to our legislature and talk to them. I know that a lot of the community groups that we fund, we ask for feedback and statistics from them so that we can continue funding them.
I was one of them funded for many years, and I greatly appreciate that. In your request was certainly not as rigorous as the federal government, but I was also at a conference on Friday. It's kind of ironic, where a national fundraiser came in for poverty programs, and the message was we cannot continue to do what we are doing with less and less money, with more and more restrictions, and to start saying no. So we are at a real dichotomy. If you're sitting and thinking that things are getting better, what I am hearing and seeing, people around me getting ready to say, no, we won't do it.
Well, let me just say that I don't disagree with you. Things are getting tougher to maintain what we had. I'm just saying that my example was trying to bring other communities together. Yeah, no, not only the social side, but also the nuts and bolts, the infrastructure in our communities, that I think more and more we're going to have to work together as communities. We're going to have to cross community lines. We're going to have to try to get all our data from not just Portsmouth, but from the other communities, and put it together so that we can maybe try to get some more demonstration programs that we can work with the federal government on.
Can I just jump in really quickly? I think on this particular point, there are three things I'd like to say. One is we have allowed policymakers to develop a posture, not all of them, but many of them, where they actually get points for saying, I'm not going to put one more dollar into evaluation. We're going to give them 0.5%. That's what we get. To evaluate whether this program works. By the way, you're supposed to also disseminate whether or not it worked on that same 0.5%. That is not smart policymaking, flat out. Programs like yours, programs like others across the country, the hardest dollars to raise are the dollars to evaluate what you're doing, not to actually operate. So if anyone's going to do it, people on the government side need to be funding the infrastructure, funding the studies that are going to do this work. And more we're seeing openness to doing that. Our agency's gotten some flexibility to do it, but it actually needs to be built into the program, so you're not doing something that is almost useless, which is evaluating across an entire program whether it worked, but evaluating the specific implementations and interventions that people tried and whether those worked, and giving feedback on it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that this point about the difference in resources is one of the reasons that we do have to build a national approach to this work. You're seeing both on the private side and the public side, people trying to figure out what does it look like to build the data infrastructure and other things that allow us to do this work on an ongoing basis, and to make it really low cost to figure out, relatively, whether things are working. And so whether it's the Bloomberg Initiative with the Smart Cities work that they're doing, or whether, what's the name of it?
What Works Cities.
What Works Cities work that they're doing, or whether it's the work that the Department of Housing and Urban Development is doing, HUD, where they're actually looking at building the infrastructure to be able to understand very well what's happening with their residents and share data across systems in order to do so. Those are the kind of things that should alleviate the burden on individual community-based nonprofits to try and figure out how to do that stuff on their own. The third thing, though, is that the gold standard is not the only standard. And what we've tried to do is to establish a spectrum of data, and going from collection of data to performance data to then actually developing the lowest levels of evidence to all the way to the gold standards of evidence. And while we're in this process of getting to having lots and lots of this, we need to get better and better at sorting our way through how people gather this data, and we decide whether it's good enough given the outcomes that we're seeing. That's going to be hard work, but it's worth doing.
I want to make a point too, very quickly. I'm actually very young, as you can see, but my ears are old, so I might have missed some of the things you said. But I thought I heard you say about, we know that welfare reform is not working in certain circumstances. All right, we found out as a result of welfare reform that there is a group of mothers on welfare who really have a lot. I'm going to finish this.
Listen to that, because the problem is that the income guidelines for different programs are all different. get Medicaid and go back to work cannot do it because everybody's guidelines are different. So you're blaming the victim. They're not the people. They want to go to work. They want to have a meaningful life. It's the system that has said no.
Okay, I'm going to continue with my blaming of the victim, if whether you mind or not. And here's the point I want to make. We have found that most mothers on welfare were capable of work. They could leave the rolls. They could earn what equivalent now of about $9 an hour. We subsidize their income. They're better off. Their children are better off. There's evidence that children perform better in school and so forth and so on. But there are mothers on welfare who have a very difficult time doing that. We've done a lot of research on this. Those mothers tend to have multiple problems. So they have low literacy, they have low mathematics skills, they have 3 or more children, they have transportation problems and so forth. And that group of mothers, and here's the point I want to make. We have social problems that we don't have clear, good solutions for. And we cannot persist in saying, as policymakers sometimes do, well, we took care of that, and we've got this problem solved. So we did solve a big problem, or at least made it much better. We reduced poverty, increased work, did all the things the American public wanted. But we found out that these mothers on welfare really, some of them have a lot of trouble. And we have not developed good programs, even though we've spent a fair amount of money on research. And I bet this is a problem. I know many other areas where we really have a lot of trouble making progress. Teen drinking, for example, is another one. There are just some people who are very difficult to get them to change their ways. And we need to continue focusing on that, and one of them was revealed by welfare reform. We never saw it so clearly as we did when a lot of people left the rolls, and the ones that left were had relatively bigger problems, and we're trying to develop solutions for them now, but we're not making a lot of progress.
Great. Oh, yes, in the back.
Ken Johnson, University of New Hampshire. I wonder if you could talk to what role the university and the university's research arms have to do in this whole process that you're discussing.
I wish a lot. I mean, the reality is that almost every university sits in the middle of a community. It has people in it who are expert in doing research at a variety of different levels. In most cases, in particular in the social issues that we're focused on, there are schools of study, both in the work and practice as well as the policy in those areas. And the ability to create and support the infrastructure that could collect data, understands how you protect privacy and all that good stuff is something that universities have to think about all the time. There should be a very tight marriage between university and the communities that are trying to figure out how to solve these problems. And it's odd to me that it actually hasn't formed, to be blunt.
I agree with all that. I was at the University of North Carolina for many years. And on the one hand, we had institutes there, especially the Frank Porter M. Child Development Center, that was very focused on preschool programs and helping poor kids get ready for the public schools. We developed programs. We worked with governors from both parties. North Carolina had especially for a southern state, had very progressive social policies for the preschool years, still to this day considered to be a leader in preschool education. And it was because of the productive relationship between the university and policymakers in Raleigh. On the other hand, North Carolina also has a major problem with child abuse and neglect, serious problems with child welfare all over the state, and there was not nearly as productive a relationship. So I think there are issues on both sides that policymakers don't necessarily try to develop relationships with universities, and I think a lot of universities stay in their ivory tower and aren't aggressive in trying to help solve public problems. So I think both sides need to work harder at it. I think universities can make a great contribution, and that's my example from North Carolina with preschool programs.
And there's a lot of exciting work going on at the local level, and I'll just give you 2 examples that I'm familiar with. So our organization, we have a local Moneyball for Government fellowship program, and we elected 11 local government leaders for an 18-month fellowship with us. So they're now developing citywide goals for the first time ever. They're figuring out what kind of data they have available and creating open data policies for their residents. And these are some of the big cities, but we also have cities like Albuquerque and Tulsa and some other smaller cities that are a part of this effort. Yeah, Jim referenced Bloomberg Philanthropies also in April announced a new effort called What Works Cities. and their goal is to try to engage 100 mid-sized cities across the country and help them do 5 things: create open data policies, create city stat systems, which is similar to what you were describing is going on in Portsmouth, to run low-cost evaluations of some of their ongoing programs, to enact procurement reform so that procurement is more focused on results and data. So I would say that universities can play a very big role working with foundations, working directly with cities to help them think through how to solve these big problems. And we can help connect the dots, but you have a lot of great, local leaders here and organizations that I'm sure are doing similar work.
Follow-up question. In the discussions within the federal government about the issue of creating this, has any discussion been made? Is there any discussion about helping to fund the universities to develop the expertise to do this sort of thing?
Sure. In fact, in some ways, some of these programs you might say were designed specifically to create that kind of connection where anybody who receives a grant is looking for an evaluation partner to work with them to do that work. We can't do the matchmaking, as you might well guess, but what we can do is try and put the funding out there and incentives for people to find each other. The challenge that, to be honest, that most of the grantees that I've talked to have found is that they almost feel forced to go to these big research shops. That because those are the ones who are interested in doing the evaluations for them, they find that if they have a really hard time trying to find their way to some individual faculty member who might be interested in help in their particular topic area, and then working with their own evaluation, and then knows enough about evaluation to produce the kind of evaluation that's required by the program. So somehow the infrastructure for receiving that kind of opportunity needs to be beefed up in most places, I think, and made transparent to the grantees who receive the funding.
Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting model at the U.S. Department of Labor. About 3 years ago, they created a new position, Chief Evaluation Officer, with budget and authority to evaluate DOL programs. And so that person who has 30 years of research experience, their model is they have some universities and some private research firms that are on call for whenever they decide to evaluate some of these major workforce development programs. So that's also something that we can help connect you to. But I'm sure that there are a lot of other examples like that within the federal government to help connect universities to the research and to the funding.
Can I say it just a little bit more bluntly? This is one of those things where if you build the infrastructure to be able to do this kind of work, and you fund the community, partner with your community, it makes you more competitive, and the funding will show. But if you don't have something to show that you're actually able to deliver, then it becomes very difficult to access the funding.
Yes, in the back.
Comment and a question. I'm Neil Kirk, State Representative in New Hampshire. A lot of organizations that come before the legislature requesting new programs explain to us that if you spend $1 on our program, it'll bring you a $9 return in terms of the gross state product. When you add up all of the claims, it's much higher than the state gross product. Which brings me to the point. Unless there is a standard for doing cost-effectiveness studies or evidence-based studies, we in the legislature won't be able to use this information because everybody will come in with a study that proves they're both cost-effective and evidence-based. So there has to be standards. And now the question. Let's say you're concerned about the opioid epidemic, and somebody comes in with a evidence-based program with respect to prevention. We're going to educate people so nobody uses opioids. And somebody else comes in with a program that says, we're going to treat people so they're totally cured, and they define cure as being off opioids for 5 months or 3 months or 3 years, whatever it might be. And somebody comes in with some other programs. These are very different kinds of things. If each one of them has a cost-effectiveness number and a evidence-based number, how do you choose if in fact it turns out that intellectually the only thing we should do is educate and not do a thing for treatment and that area? Is that a policy issue which this information will not help us answer? Or is there some kind of information or help that you can give us in making good policy?
Yeah, this is a terrific question, and I have noticed myself. I used to be on the Ways and Means Committee in Washington, and I've noticed a number of witnesses that now appear before the Ways and Means Committee and say, "This is an evidence-based program." In fact, half the companies that Jim used to work with, the Department of Education, now suddenly all of their programs, every curriculum you see is evidence-based. Okay, here's one solution that I like a lot. I've seen it work, especially in Washington State. It works in Washington to a certain degree, and that is you need an agency that has a skeptical attitude toward these people who testify and make all these claims about their programs. We do have standards in research. Random assignment is one of them. And if they're good studies, first of all, they're about 90% of the programs that we evaluate with a good study are shown to fail. So it's not like you're going to suddenly have 5 different approaches, all of which are evidence-based. They're going to claim they are. But when someone skeptical looks at the studies that are done, they can come before you and say, the best evidence is this. And I mentioned Washington because they have an agency there called the Washington State Institute for Public Policy that for 25 years or something like that now has been studying these very issues and carefully studying the social programs that address the issues like teen pregnancy, delinquency, and so forth, and producing benefit cost numbers for legislators. And here's the real key. The legislators have worked with them so much that they trust them. And they know that if there are programs that don't work, they'll tell them that. These programs aren't, the research is not very good. If you want to try to do something, here's the best thing, but it might not work because the studies are not good enough. Or there are cases where they say, yeah, here there are 5 interventions that have consistently shown. We have that in teen pregnancy prevention. We have that in home visiting programs that have consistently shown that they'll work. And a neutral agency that works with the legislature and develops a relationship, a trust over the years can really help the legislator make better decisions on how to spend their dollars on the programs that are most important. But beware of people who come before the committee and say, this is evidence-based, because everybody's saying that now.
Yeah, just
Pretend that we've done that. The other question was, how do you choose between prevention and treatment?
Yes.
When prevention makes much more sense, but that means the state will be doing nothing for treatment.
That's a good point, but again, if you have benefit cost numbers, it will help you address that issue. They'll tell you the dollar spent on prevention or the dollar spent on treatment, which does the most good. Normally it's going to be prevention, but not always. Sometimes our prevention programs don't work very well. A great example, DARE. Oh boy, this thing is a great, I saw films that make you cry about how effective these programs are, and these kids were scared to death and so forth. And then we started getting good studies and it just doesn't work. So there are good studies that can help you make better decisions. It's never going to be perfect. And let me add one thing here that I think is really important. I mentioned that pie chart. My vision of the evidence is never going to be that we come before your committee and say, the evidence says you should do this, and if you don't, you're making a mistake. Evidence deserves a bigger place at the table than it now has, but it should never dominate at the table. It should not dominate at the table. Their values, their political views, all of these things, and great elected officials have to learn the best way to combine these things to get the right decision. I have seen many cases in Washington where the evidence was a lot clearer than it is in other cases, and yet political values absolutely trump it. And that's why Democrats that feel one way, Republicans feel the other, looking at exactly the same evidence because political philosophy plays a big role.
Over here.
I'm Representative Rennie Cushing. I'm on the Criminal Justice Committee, and following on what you said, I'm aware of the work that Washington Public Policy Institute has done. And I want to talk a little bit about corrections or the issues of over-incarceration. That I think many people have come to recognize that we have a whole lot of people in prison in this country, and maybe we are spending more money than we should on corrections. But I love data-driven work. We went through a process here in New Hampshire where we worked with Pew and we brought in stakeholders and came up with a proposal to help drive down incarceration and make us safer at the same time. But sometimes it's been my experience where I want to question where the data is that demonstrates that data-driven decision by political leaders is really supported by, when it comes election time. Because I think that around the issue of corrections, this morning I sat in a committee room dealing with maybe we can reduce mandatory minimums. We know that they don't do what they're supposed to, and yet that's one way. If we can reduce mandatory minimums, maybe we could help decrease the prison population and prison costs. But as we were talking, we realized that while the data says that mandatory minimums don't work, the idea that we're going to eliminate, the 25-year minimum sentence for drug dealers, that could have a political cost. Or the idea that we're going to eliminate some of the, sex crimes, or, in this atmosphere of, issues that relate to guns. And as we're trying to follow the data, but at the same time we're going, this is going to blow up in our face.
Yep.
We're going to, this whole thing will go down. And how do you, and nowadays elections take place in a fact-free zone. I mean, there's nobody checks on the data, and all you need to do is put up the picture of, from Willie Horton to whoever the latest boogie person is, and it's hard to want to, make a decision that is good policy when it's going to cost you. Somebody else will be making the decisions that are more responsive to an emotional appeal than a data-driven appeal. And I don't know. That's just my reality for today.
So I'll tie both of these two things together. I agree exactly with Ron got to at the end there, which is that social policy is driven by combinations of strategy informed by values and hopefully evidence and experience, right? And the reality that policy is shaped mostly, though, in this environment by politics. And politics is shaped by the stories that people tell. And so the key for us is to begin to figure out how, for every good piece of evidence that we have 10 to 15 really compelling stories to tell that illustrate for the vast majority of Americans what the potential of this evidence-based policy is. Having spent 6 years, not as long as Ron has been around the folks in DC, I can tell you that the percentage of folks that are driven by evidence is single digits. Like, they love their constituents, they love the stories that they hear, and they are moved by it. And they are extremely happy when the evidence supports the direction they want to go. And they'll waive it for you. But in the end, they are most influenced by those other factors. And so getting those moving stories that are associated with the evidence in front of both the constituents and the decision makers is as important as producing the evidence itself. It absolutely is. And so I wish I had an answer for the political quagmire we have now, because I mean, I literally had someone tell me, never mind, I won't tell that story. Let's put it this way. Money now means that even if you are doing the right thing, you are completely vulnerable. And as a country, we're going to have to figure out how we protect good people, period. And our definition of good ought to be, are they doing the right things that says what's going to work for the most people?
And one of the reasons why we wanted to have this event, why we've created this campaign, is to bring folks who agree with this, drive towards, investing taxpayers in what's working out there. If you're a Democrat, you want to make, I'm simplifying it, programs more effective. If you're a Republican, you probably want government programs to be more efficient and get the biggest bang out of the buck. So it's sort of saying the same things, and can't we all just figure out a way to across the board make sure that, yeah. So we struggle with that all the time. Want you to know that you have supporters and advocates in DC, and let's just keep building on it.
Can I add, wait, I want to add 30 seconds to that. The very best solution is the hardest one, I think, and that is bipartisanship. If you can get both sides of the aisle to agree to something, you can get a lot more done, even on this issue. And on this issue, I realize it's not good to be optimistic nowadays, but there has been a lot of progress. A lot of Republicans have really changed their tune, and they are willing to support backing off on these laws that mandatory sentencing and 3 strikes and out and that sort of thing. Not everywhere, not every time, but if I were an elected official, I would constantly try to work on that relationship across the aisle and to go to them in private with the evidence and say, if we could work together, we can make a lot of progress.
To be clear, in New Hampshire, this was a bipartisan effort, and it wasn't the people who were involved in the policy making that used it as a political wedge issue. It was people who were not part of the discussion. They didn't even care about they saw a political wedge issue that they used, and they didn't even really care about over incarceration. They had another agenda.
But that's, when I say bipartisan, I mean that. That's the point where the guy on the other party stands up, calls a press conference and says, we're doing this together, it's the right thing to do, we're going to save money, and people are going to be better off, and this guy is a charlatan who's making these arguments. If people on both sides of the aisle say that, I'm not saying it's foolproof. Nothing's foolproof, but you can make real progress that way.
Okay, we have a few more minutes, so we're going to do a lightning rounds of questions, but you in the back have been
I'll be
very...
right. I'm Representative Jack Flanagan. I'm the House Majority Leader. I live policy, and I see some of my colleagues here, and it's great to see you. For this woman up here, one of the great ways of finding out how to be more efficient or productive, especially with the social work that you do, are associations. Because I have gone to many events where I meet my contemporaries from different states. And the question is, how do we control opiates, or how do you handle Medicaid expansion? There's a large body of information, and it's free, other than attending. One of the phrases that I love in politics is everybody likes sausage and nobody likes to see how it's made. And I'm with you 100% about information-based and knowing the research behind it. But sometimes the public just doesn't want to hear it. And I'm going to give you an example. I was approached by a high-level former judiciary member to introduce legislation on the death penalty for people who commit terrorist acts. And it's in the House now. I'm not a big fan of the death penalty, but I understand the reason for it, and especially in the case where it's dealing with a terrorist act, especially since we had one in Massachusetts, that, in its right, gives us the opportunity to put the person to death. Without the statute, we couldn't. It would have to be a federal court. Now, this goes to what Representative, my colleague Remy said, is that a lot of people would think, well, I'm not a big fan of the death penalty, but the public, the majority, want people who commit terrorist acts to have penalties such as the death penalty available. So, I'm sorry, you can have press conferences all you want, but the reality is if my constituents agree with it, I represent them. That's what my title is. I represent 3,200. In this case, I represent 1.3 million because I'm the majority leader. I'm just saying is, I love the idea, I love the concept, but there is reality in what we do. And I'm sure you gentlemen know what I'm talking about. So it's a difficult trade-off, and you try to do the best you can. Some people are happy, and I'm sure people in this room say, oh, I'm against the death penalty, and I'm sure there's other people saying, yeah, that's the right thing. So it's a balancing act. Like I said, everybody likes sausage. A lot of times they don't like how it's made. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes.
Yes, hi. My name is Eileen Smart. I work for the Corporation for National and Community Service. I'm actually a program officer for the field office, for our DC office. So I am right in the trenches. We are an agency in the last 10 years that's gone from day to night, night to day. I mean, we have completely revamped the way that we grant our federal resources using much of the Moneyball sort of method. And I will have to say, it has been hard, and it's hard right now. We're right into the big transition of getting our grantees to go more for the outcome-based. We're starting to actually connect our grant dollars with the amount of volunteers that you have that are actually in outcome-based performance measures that you have. It's getting to that phase of what we're going through. And we're an agency that grants the funding, the resources for AmeriCorps Vista, which is much like the Peace Corps, only you're doing a service in this country. Also with Senior Corps, we're out in the community. We're in the prisons here in New Hampshire. We're working with the CAP agencies, our funds. This is hard for our grantees, very hard, but because we have the luxury of having field officers, we get to work really close with them and listen to some of the challenges and frustrations and feed that information up. We're an agency that's been able to adjust some of our requirements because we're listening and hearing some of the challenges. And I'll tell you, it's hard, but the feedback we're getting is they're getting excited over the fact that, God, we are really making a difference, and now we understand why, and here's the proof. And now I can go to actual other funders to prove that now. So as hard as it's been, we've actually had to steer them to repositories that have evidence-based information out, so they can actually go and find where those things are happening.
We've been working very closely with the Corporation for National Community Service in DC, so you're exactly right that I believe about 8% of the application process is now focused on evidence, whereas a year and a half ago it was 0. So you're definitely moving on the right path,
yes.
And we applaud you for what you've been doing, so thank you. We have time for one more question and then some closing remarks from our panelists.
My name's Doug Scammon. I've been involved in budgets at almost every level of government. I have a little different tack. Earlier it was mentioned that North Dakota education doesn't need to be the same as the inner cities, and it certainly, I think that's pretty easy to concept to see. Would it be possible for Washington to think about spending much less money in education, maybe sending half of it back to the states and not spending money to figure out how they're going to run education because of this other fact? I know, when you pass a federal law, you've got a lot of administrators in Washington working on education funding, then you've got the state board and the State Department, then you've got superintendents and principals and teachers that have to make out these reports. New Hampshire is kind of a local control state. Is it possible that maybe we'd be better off as a country to spend our money that way rather than studying how you're going to make every school all over this country work?
Do you want to take that, Jim?
Sure, I'll take it, especially since I'm not in office anymore. I mean, so here's what I would say. What I'll say is that we don't need to have the debate about federal versus state on education. States are supposed to be accountable for producing equitable, excellent education for every kid in their state, and almost every state has that in their constitution. The reality is that the federal government was set up for a couple of reasons. One is because that wasn't happening for every kid. 2 is that we have some very specific needs for low-income kids and kids with special needs. And 3 is that, one of the benefits that we have of being a nation of states is the ability to learn from each other, and we ought to be able to figure out how to take advantage of that, create an R&D infrastructure like we do for things like defense and medicine and health, and actually serve that up to everyone so they can benefit from it. The way programs are structured right now doesn't actually build off of anything that we talked about today. One of the reasons that is probably most frustrating at the state level is the high fragmentation and the amount of prescription that is written in the legislation by people who come here from your states, where they try and describe how you ought to spend the money down to the last dollar in the legislation itself. So here's what I'll say. I in particular, this is not an Obama administration position, this is me, Jim Shelton, speaking as now a free citizen. When I took on the role of creating that Invest in Innovation Fund, there was some talk that it would actually go up in funding the next year. And my idea at that time was that we would not keep the money at the department, but in fact we would actually do a state competition to get the money to go out to states, so that states that agreed to set up a similar infrastructure using evidence to make their decisions about how they're going to use the funding could use that. They put up some of their funding, they matched the federal funding, and then the decisions would be made at the local level about using the same common, the gentleman who said you need standards, common standards of evidence so we know we're comparing apples to apples. But the states then could run their own processes. Now imagine if all 50 states had that kind of system going, where you had a tiered evidence framework, you had people applying from the districts within the state to see what's working, you funded the things that were working the most, you had evaluations coming from all 50 states of all the different innovations that are happening every day in the country, and they fed into a central repository where we then could share it nationally. Imagine what that would look like. Well, if you did that for a while, the amount that you would prescribe from any level ought to be going down fairly dramatically, because the pool of what works it makes it easy for everybody to see whether you're doing something smart or not. Now that, I think, has a shot. The problem is nobody trusts anybody right now. And so without knowing where the money's going to go, pretty much the evidence has been that it doesn't necessarily go so far to folks who need it most. We've seen at the state level dramatic cuts in education, especially in higher education. We've seen, especially at the state level, dramatic cuts to kids who actually need the funding most. And that's without a change at the federal level. So I'm not sure we're going to come to terms on that one right away, but I do think that there's a way to come to terms on how we could begin to build common tools and resources to at least make the money that we spend, however we spend it, get spent on the right things and help each other across the country.
I think the general model for federal support of the states and localities should be the federal government says, here are the outcomes that you should produce with this money, and we need data set, and it's more complicated on letting on. But we should not specify the process. We should leave that up to the states. As long as they report good data on the outcomes that we all agree to, then give them much more flexibility. That, I think, is a general model that ought to be the first thing that we try in all these cases.
Totally agreed with one friendly amendment, which is disaggregate it to make sure that you get into all the different populations. I've talked for too long in this part, but I'll just say this. Like, the ideal outcome, I think almost everyone in here, if you only had to pay for things when they work for you, that's like ideal, right? So let's say that that is the ideal state. All right, so the next best state is, well, we set up a system that creates incredible incentives because people have to try for, we'll pay you most when it works. Well, then what's the next best thing? Well, if I can't get you quite to that system, I at least want to pay you on the probability that it's going to work. And that's all the evidence is, right? It's a probability that it's going to work versus anything else. And then you just keep working your way back from there. If we can keep that in mind, that what we're trying to do is get to a system, like Ron described, where we pay people for delivering outcomes, then everything else falls into place.
With all due respect, what are you paying us with? We give you the money to Washington, we do what you say, and then you give it back to us? I mean, that's what you're saying. And our Constitution has education in it. And like you said, the federal Constitution doesn't have education in it. Please tell us what you're giving us back is really our own money.
Except that's not completely true, because the federal government, especially in education and many other areas of social policy, we actually run a big shifting operation where we give more money to states who have less of it to start with to create some kind of equity. But even if you, to the extent that you're true, it would be better to have a system where when we give your money back to you, we ask you to produce outcomes and show that you're producing outcomes and leave it up to you to decide how to do it.
And on that note, I think this is a good reminder that we may be using the words data, evidence, and evaluation, but at the end of the day, what we're all trying to do is to improve people's lives. And I think the fact that so many of you came out for this discussion, that there is growing bipartisan momentum across the country to try to get to, figuring out what works and then, investing our dollars in those efforts. I feel good and hopeful that we're on the right track, regardless of, some of the forums where there doesn't seem to be this optimistic look, but I'm still hopeful. So let me just open it up for 30 seconds or less from each of our panelists. Any parting words on folks who are here in the, first in the nation primary state about what they can do, in their daily lives when they come across candidates or others to keep this agenda moving forward?
Well, from my perspective in the local government, of course, I think it's important to talk about the support for the various programs that are in place, but also showing the evidence that has come out of some of those programs, such as the Clean Water Act. If there are things that we have to do which have been funded in the past that have proven to be successful, why has it all been cut back? Why can't we start looking more at having more support for that? Because those are some of the things that have worked over the years, and it's becoming more difficult for municipalities, a community of $21,000, to try to be in compliance with the regulations. We've shown where we can do it, but there's certain cost factors that that we can't go over the barrier, and that maybe there are demonstration projects which we'll try in New Hampshire, bringing people together to do a larger scale projects where you have the economies of scale to help with some of the infrastructure you need to do in the case of wastewater treatment plants and those types of things.
Great. Jim?
I just want to leave with two thoughts. As we enter this season, we're going to have to ask, are we interested in people that are interested in the fight or interested in outcomes? There's lots and lots of discussion to have back and forth about things that we know we're going to come to a conclusion on. In the meantime, there are lots of things that we can be doing to actually move things forward. You're going to have to decide where you want to be on that and who you want to vote for based on where they are on that. The second is, one of the things that came up is this question of how you make these decisions. And people who are going to be committed to using this evidence work are going to need two really core characteristics if you're going to really be committed to it. The first is humility, because the question really comes down to it is, what about when the evidence shows something that you fundamentally didn't believe until the evidence showed it was true? And the second one is courage, because what about when the evidence shows you something that most people don't want to believe is true, or most of your people don't want to believe is true? And as a leader, if you can't bring those two things to the table for your constituents, then you need to ask why you're there. And I, as a voter, I definitely am going to ask why you're there. Right?
So I'm from Washington. I'm afflicted with all kinds of bad habits because of that. And one of them is I can't clear my throat in 30 seconds. So let me just say, I'm really grateful to people who came out. You have no idea how useful it is to be from Washington and to go to the states and localities and hear what people there say, especially elected officials. And I found, like I did today, that our elected officials are really very knowledgeable and have very clear views, and they express them clearly. So I'm very grateful I had a chance to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Michael, the Carsey School, the Rudman Center, and some closing words from Michael.
Yeah, it's all good news. We have a reception. I don't know, where do we go, downstairs? Down the stairs. I just like to add one, I get my two, I'm sitting here very quietly over here, and I just like to say, there are decisions going to be made that have nothing to do with the evidence. That's just the fact. Things get, energized politically, and that's always going to happen. But there's then a huge swath of things where we can make evidence play a bigger role than it's playing. And I think a great deal of progress is being made. I think, what was discussed in terms of the Obama administration efforts, there have been efforts by governors, Washington State, which has been, a bipartisan effort over many, many years. So I think there are examples where, in fact, we've been making lots of progress, and I think Results for America is making a big contribution in moving that agenda. So I think that's very important. So I just wanted to put in that 2 cents and tell you about the reception. So thank you, everyone, for coming.